I've worked night shifts for most of my adult life, and honestly, I think people romanticize rural areas way too much. Everybody pictures peaceful ranches, fresh air, horses running around under sunsets, all that movie nonsense. Nobody talks about what those places actually feel like after midnight. Because the countryside at night is different. Not quiet, different. You hear things constantly out there. Wind hitting old metal roofing, animals shifting around in barns, tree branches scraping against fences, coyotes way off in the distance. Sometimes something splashing around in a creek you can't even see. And after enough years working emergency calls in places like that, your brain starts doing this thing where every shadow feels important. Every sound feels like it means something. You start paying attention to instincts you'd laugh at during the daytime. Which sounds ridiculous, I know. I used to make fun of people who talked like that. Then I started working nights, and eventually I realized something. The people who spend their lives out in isolated places get nervous for a reason. They've seen things. Not paranormal stuff necessarily, just human stuff. The kind of situations that only happen when people are far away from everybody else. No witnesses, no help nearby, no police coming quickly if things go wrong. And trust me, things go wrong out there all the time. For context, I am a large animal vet, mostly horses, livestock too occasionally, although over the years I've somehow ended up treating things I definitely never expected to see outside a zoo documentary. You'd honestly be surprised what people privately own once you get out into wealthy ranch territory. I've treated injured wolves before, an aging zebra one time, a sedated tiger that started waking up halfway through a procedure, which genuinely shaved a few years off my life. I've had a horse nearly crush my leg against a trailer gate, had a bull charge me through mud so thick I lost one of my boots trying to run, and one particularly horrible summer, I climbed halfway up a tree because a group of feral hogs decided they hated me personally. People laugh when I tell that story, but feral hogs are horrifying. Those things look at you like they already know what your insides taste like. Still though, somehow none of those moments became the scariest night of my career. That title belongs to a rainy Thursday night about 6 years ago, and weirdly enough, it started with a horse named Clover. Now, the call came in a little after 1 in the morning while I was sitting on my couch eating microwave noodles and pretending to pay attention to some true crime documentary on TV. I don't even remember what the documentary was about now, probably some serial killer. Those things all blur together after a while. Honestly, working emergency veterinary calls ruins your ability to relax sometimes, because your phone ringing after midnight almost never means anything good. Usually it means somebody's animal is dying, or already dead. So when my phone started vibrating on the coffee table, my first instinct was actually to ignore it. I figured it was spam, or maybe one of those wrong number emergency calls I'd gotten a few times before. Then I saw the name on the screen, Walter Brennan, and immediately my stomach dropped. Now, the Brennans weren't just regular clients. My dad treated their animals before I even became a vet myself. I practically grew up around those people. Mrs. Brennan still called me kiddo well into my 30s, and Walter was one of those old-school ranchmen who somehow looked 70 and 50 at the exact same time. You know the type. Sunburned skin, permanent squint, hands that looked carved out of tree bark, the kind of guy who would rather staple his own arm shut than spend money at a hospital. Honestly, both of them were like that. They handled almost everything themselves. Broken fence, Walter fixes it. Horse gets sick, Walter handles it. Storm damage, Walter handles it. Power outage, Walter handles it. One time the man literally stitched his own shoulder after getting cut on farm equipment because he didn't feel like driving into town. That generation is built different in ways that are honestly terrifying. So if the Brennans were calling me at 1 in the morning, something had gone seriously wrong. Mrs. Brennan answered when I picked up, and immediately I could tell she'd been crying. Not loudly, not hysterically. Honestly, that almost made it worse. It was the kind of exhausted voice somebody has after crying for hours and finally running out of energy. She explained that Clover, their oldest horse, had suddenly gotten much worse sometime after dinner. Wouldn't stand properly, wouldn't eat, breathing hard, sweating heavily. And according to Walter, he'd started making this horrible low wheezing sound whenever he tried to move. Now, horses are tricky animals. They're beautiful, intelligent creatures, but biologically they're kind of disasters. People who don't work around them don't realize how fragile they actually are. A horse can survive things that would kill a person instantly, and then randomly die because its stomach got twisted weird. They panic easily too. A frightened horse can injure itself badly in seconds, and older horses especially can decline very, very fast. So while Mrs. Brennan talked, part of my brain was already preparing for the possibility that I might have to put Clover down that night. And trust me, that never gets easier. I don't care how long somebody's been in this profession, you never really get used to ending an animal's life, even when it's the humane thing to do.
especially horses. People bond with horses differently than they do most animals. It's hard to explain unless you grew up around them. These animals become part of daily lives for decades sometimes. Families grow up alongside them. Kids learn to ride on them. People tell them secrets. Hell, some ranchers talk to their horses more than they talk to their spouses. And according to Mrs. Brennan, Clover had originally belonged to their son before things went bad. At the time, I didn't really know what she meant by that. I figured maybe he'd moved away or something. Honestly, I didn't ask. When somebody sounds that emotionally drained, you stop asking unnecessary questions. I just told her I'd head on her immediately. Then I grabbed my medical kit, threw on my jacket, and headed out into the rain. And looking back now, I think part of me already knew something about that night felt wrong. Not dangerous exactly, just off. Like the atmosphere itself was trying to warn me to stay home.
The Brennans lived about 45 minutes outside town. Closer to an hour if the roads were bad. And that night, the roads were horrible. Rain had been coming down for most of the evening. Not hard exactly, but steady enough to turn the dirt roads into thick mud. The kind that grabs your tires every few seconds and makes you feel like your vehicle's about to slide straight into a ditch. I remember driving slower than usual that night, partly because of the weather, partly because country roads at night genuinely terrify me. People who haven't driven through rural areas after midnight probably won't understand that feeling. There's this weird isolation to it. No lights, no houses for miles sometimes. Just endless darkness outside your headlights. You start realizing how vulnerable you really are out there. If your car breaks down, you're stranded. If something happens, nobody hears you. And if somebody wanted to hurt you out there, honestly, they probably could. That thought crossed my mind more than once during the drive, especially after I noticed I'd lost cell service about 20 minutes from the ranch. That was normal for the area, but I still hated it. I kept trying to distract myself by thinking about Clover, trying to mentally prepare for what condition he might be in when I arrived. Old horses can decline fast, very fast. You go from, he seems a little tired, to, we need to euthanize him tonight, in just a few hours sometimes. And the emotional part is always worse when the owners have known the animal for decades. You can feel people grieving before the horse is even gone. That's honestly the hardest part of the job sometimes. Not the blood, not injuries, not surgeries. Watching people lose something they genuinely loved. By the time I finally turned onto the Brennan property, the rain had eased into more of a mist. But the entire ranch looked wrong somehow. Too dark. The barn lights were on, but only barely. That weak yellow glow old bulbs give off when they're close to dying. And I immediately noticed something else. An unfamiliar truck parked beside the barn. Now, that might not sound important, but out in places like that, random vehicles stand out immediately, especially late at night, especially when Mrs. Brennan specifically told me it would just be her and Walter there. The truck itself looked rough, older model, mud caked halfway up the sides, driver's side headlight cracked, and there were empty beer bottles sitting in the bed of the truck getting filled with rainwater. I remember sitting there in my Jeep for a few seconds staring at it. Just thinking. Something about it made me uncomfortable immediately. Not enough to leave, but enough that I locked my vehicle after stepping out, which honestly wasn't something I normally did on ranch calls. The mud was awful. Every step toward the barn made this horrible sucking sound. At one point, I almost lost a boot completely trying to cross near the gate. And the closer I got to the barn, the more wrong everything started feeling. The horses were restless. I could hear them moving around inside, snorting, kicking wood occasionally. Animals notice tension long before humans do. That's something people underestimate. A nervous animal usually means something nearby is making it nervous. Then I heard shouting. Not loud shouting. The kind of angry yelling where somebody is trying very hard not to completely lose control. I stopped immediately. The barn doors were partially open and light spilled out across the mud. At first, I assumed maybe Walter and one of the ranch hands were arguing. Then I heard Mrs. Brennan crying, and every instinct in my body started screaming that something was wrong. I moved closer carefully after that. Not dramatically, not like in a movie. Honestly, I was trying not to panic. There's this strange thing that happens when your brain senses danger before you fully understand it. Everything starts feeling sharper. You notice tiny details. The smell of wet wood. The sound of rain tapping metal roofing. Your own breathing. I remember hearing my heartbeat in my ears as I got close enough to look through the gap between the barn doors. And what I saw almost made me freeze completely. There was a man standing in the middle of the barn, pointing a shotgun at Walter and Mrs. Brennan. At first, I didn't recognize him. He looked awful. Thin, dirty, hair hanging down over his face, jittering constantly like he couldn't stand still. The shotgun itself shook in his hands every few seconds. Mrs. Brennan was crying openly now. Walter looked furious but also terrified underneath it. And then the man turned slightly, just enough for me to finally recognize him. Ethan Brennan. Their son. I hadn't seen him in years. Not since he was maybe 19 or 20. Back then he'd been quiet, awkward, honestly kind of sweet from what I remembered. Now he looked like somebody who hadn't slept properly in months. His face was gaunt, eyes sunken, skin pale in that unhealthy way people get after long-term drug use. And even from several feet away, I could tell he was completely out of it. The shotgun jerked wildly every time he moved. That terrified me more than anything else. A calm person with a gun is dangerous. A panicked person with a gun is unpredictable. And unpredictable people are how accidents happen. I stayed outside listening for another few seconds, trying to understand what was happening. Most of it was Ethan screaming about money. Apparently he owed people something. A lot of money from the sound of it. Walter kept trying to reason with him. Mrs. Brennan kept begging him to put the gun down. And Ethan just kept pacing back and forth near Clover's stall, ranting about how everybody thought he was a failure. Then suddenly he stopped talking. Completely. The silence that followed honestly scared me more than the yelling. Because the second people with that kind of emotional energy go quiet, you know something's changing in their head.
I stayed outside the barn longer than I should have. Not because I was thinking. Because my body didn't fully agree with what my mind had already understood. There are moments in this job where you see things that don't immediately register as danger. Not because they are dangerous, but because your brain refuses to accept that something like that is actually happening in front of you. A man with a shotgun in a family barn. A couple you've known for years. And a situation that is already too far gone to feel normal anymore. The barn itself felt different that night. Not just dim, heavy. Like the air inside had thickened. The kind of stillness that doesn't belong in a place with animals. Even the horses weren't behaving normally. They weren't panicking yet. That's the worst part. It wasn't chaos. It was anticipation. Like they were waiting for something they could already sense before we could. I could hear Clover shifting inside his stall. Slow movements. Wood creaking. A soft, uneven breath that didn't match his usual rhythm. And that alone made something tighten in my chest. Then I heard Ethan again. His voice carried out through the barn doors in fragments. Not steady speech. Not even proper shouting anymore. Just broken pieces of thought spilling out. Anger. Confusion. Something that almost sounded like pleading buried underneath it. I remember taking one step closer without fully deciding to. Just enough to see through the gap between the barn doors. And that's when everything became real.
Ethan Brennan was standing in the center of the barn. He looked like someone who had been awake for too long. Not just tired, worn down in a way that sleep wouldn't fix. His face was thin, almost hollow, eyes too wide for his expression, like his body had stopped matching his mind a long time ago. The shotgun in his hands kept shifting slightly, not aimed at anything specific, just existing as a threat in every direction at once. Walter and Mrs. Brennan were standing a few steps apart from him, neither of them moving. That kind of stillness you only see when people are trying not to trigger a violent situation. Mrs. Brennan was crying quietly, just exhausted tears sliding down her face without sound. Walter looked like he was holding himself together by pure force, jaw clenched, hands open at his sides, like if he moved wrong, everything would collapse. And Clover's stall was directly behind Ethan. That detail mattered more than anything else, because every time Ethan shifted, he drifted closer to that stall without even realizing it, like something was pulling him toward it. Ethan suddenly stopped speaking, completely. The change was immediate, just silence. And that silence felt louder than everything before it. He turned his head slightly, not toward his parents, toward the stalls. Then he moved. One step, then another. Slow, uncertain. The shotgun lowered slightly, but not safe, not even close. He said the horse's name, Clover, and everything changed. Walter tried to speak to him, but Ethan didn't respond. He was locked onto the stall now, completely focused. Then Mrs. Brennan said his name, softly, and Ethan broke slightly. He asked if Clover was okay. Walter hesitated. That hesitation was enough. Ethan noticed it, and his breathing changed again. Faster, sharper. The shotgun lifted halfway, then stopped. I realized he was slipping out of control again, and that's when I stepped forward into the barn.
Inside him was shifting in real time, and everyone in that barn could feel it happening, even if nobody wanted to acknowledge it. His shotgun was still raised, but it wasn't steady anymore. It drifted slightly with every breath he took, like his body couldn't decide what it was supposed to do with itself. And that's what made it worse. Not aggression, instability. Because aggressive people follow intent. Unstable people follow impulse, and impulse is unpredictable. Clover moved again inside the stall. A slow shift of weight, wood creaking beneath him, a soft sound of breath that didn't belong in a moment like this. And Ethan reacted immediately to that sound. Not violently, not logically, just instinctively. His head turned slightly toward the stall, like something had pulled him, and for the first time since I stepped into the barn, the shotgun lowered a fraction. Not enough to be safe, not even close, but enough to notice. Walter saw it too. He didn't rush it, didn't push. He just spoke Ethan's name again, carefully, measured, like he was talking to someone standing on the edge of something they might fall off at any second. Ethan, look at me. But Ethan didn't. His eyes stayed locked on the stall, and I realized something in that moment. He wasn't fully present in the barn anymore. He was split. Half of him here, half of him somewhere else entirely. Then he spoke, quietly. Clover. Just the name, no emotion attached to it. And that was what made it feel wrong, because it didn't sound like anger. It didn't sound like threat. It sounded like memory leaking into the present.
Mrs. Brennan made a small sound behind him. Not a scream, not even words, just the kind of broken noise people make when they don't know how to respond to what they're seeing. Walter tried again, slowly. He told Ethan that Clover was still here, still alive, still the same horse he remembered. That sentence hit harder than anything else had so far, because Ethan physically reacted, not dramatically, but enough. His shoulders tightened, his grip shifted, the shotgun lowered slightly more, but then stopped, frozen again, like something inside him was resisting letting go completely. He took one step toward the stall, then another. And Clover responded, a soft movement, a shift of weight, like he was aware of everything happening, but not afraid of it. That reaction seemed to anchor Ethan for a moment. His breathing slowed slightly, just slightly, and I could see it clearly now. This wasn't just a breakdown, it was memory overload colliding with withdrawal, exhaustion, and emotional trauma, a system failing to separate past from present. He stopped walking, stood right in front of the stall, the shotgun lowered again, now hanging at a dangerous angle toward the ground, and he spoke. Not to us, to the horse. He said he remembered mornings. Early mornings, riding Clover before anything in his life went wrong. His voice cracked slightly on the last words. That crack mattered, because it was the first real fracture in his emotional state. Walter didn't interrupt. He just watched. Mrs. Brennan was shaking now, silently crying, and Clover shifted again. That small movement seemed to pull Ethan further inward, not outward toward violence, but inward toward memory. He leaned slightly toward the stall door, like he wanted to see him properly, and then something changed in his tone again. He asked if Clover was still eating properly. That question wasn't random. It wasn't part of the confrontation. It was attachment, real attachment. Walter hesitated before answering, only a fraction of a second, but Ethan caught it instantly, and his breathing changed again, faster, sharper. The shotgun lifted halfway without him even fully realizing it. That was the danger point, because he was no longer fully controlling it consciously. He was reacting emotionally, and emotional reactions don't filter consequences. I remember thinking very clearly at that moment that we were seconds away from everything collapsing again. But then Walter spoke. Very carefully, he said yes, just that, one word, simple, direct, no hesitation this time. And that answer hit Ethan differently than anything else had. He froze, completely, like his brain had locked onto that confirmation and didn't know how to process it. Then he lowered the shotgun slightly again. Not safe, not resolved, but no longer immediate threat. He stepped closer to the stall, now standing right at the door, and I could hear Clover breathing clearly, slow, heavy, alive. Ethan reached out one hand toward the wood, but stopped before touching it, like he wasn't sure if he was allowed to cross that boundary anymore. And then he said something quieter, something I barely caught. He said he didn't know they were letting him get sick. That sentence changed the tone instantly, because it wasn't anger anymore. It was accusation wrapped around confusion. Walter opened his mouth to respond, but Ethan shook his head. Too fast, too emotional. He didn't want explanations. He wanted something else, something simpler, something that made sense of what he was feeling. The shotgun lifted slightly again, and I could feel the situation slipping back toward danger. But then I spoke, not loudly, not sharply, just enough to interrupt the spiral. I told him I was there for Clover, that I had been called because something was wrong, and that I needed to check him. That sentence shifted everything again.
Because it redirected him, not away from emotion, but toward purpose. Ethan turned toward me slowly, studying me, measuring whether I belonged in the situation or not, and for the first time the shotgun wasn't the focus anymore. Clover was. I took one step closer, carefully, slow enough not to trigger anything, and I told him I needed access to the stall to help the horse. Silence followed, heavy, long. Then slowly Ethan lowered the shotgun completely. Not safe, not resolved, but no longer immediate threat. He stepped aside, just enough for me to pass, but not enough to relax. His eyes stayed locked on me the entire time, watching every movement, every breath, every decision. And as I moved toward Clover's stall, I understood something very clearly. This wasn't a resolution. It was a pivot point, and whatever happened next would depend entirely on whether trust held or collapsed.
The moment I stepped closer to Clover's stall, the entire barn felt like it changed pressure. Not louder, not quieter, just heavier. Like the air itself had thickened around us, refusing to move properly. Ethan didn't move behind me, but I felt him there. Not watching aggressively anymore, not threatening, just suspended. Like his entire body had run out of directions to go and was now waiting for whatever came next. Clover stood in the stall, shifting slightly on his legs. Slow movements, careful ones. The kind older horses make when their joints don't respond the way they used to. Nothing violent, nothing dramatic, just age, just wear. I reached the stall door slowly. My hand rested on the wood for a moment before I pushed it open. It creaked louder than I wanted. That small sound made Ethan shift behind me. Not forward, not back, just a reaction. Like his nervous system was still tuned to danger, even if his mind was trying to step away from it. I stepped inside the stall. The smell changed immediately. Warm hay, animal sweat, and something slightly off beneath it. Not strong enough to confirm anything yet, but enough to make me pay closer attention. Clover turned his head toward me slowly. He recognized me. That alone reduced the tension in my chest slightly. Animals don't perform. They don't pretend. They just respond. I placed my hand gently on his neck first, feeling for temperature, then muscle tension, then breathing rhythm. Everything was slow. Everything was controlled. Behind me, Ethan spoke again. Quiet this time. No shouting, no urgency. Just a broken question asking if Clover was in pain. I didn't answer immediately, not because I was avoiding him, but because I needed accuracy more than comfort. I moved my hand along Clover's body slowly, down his shoulder, across his ribs, watching for reactions, listening for changes in breathing. Each second felt longer than it should have. Behind me, Ethan didn't interrupt. That silence was different now. Not aggressive, not unstable, just waiting. I checked Clover's legs next, one by one, carefully lifting each hoof, feeling for heat, for swelling, for uneven pressure. The barn was so quiet that even the smallest sounds felt amplified. Wood shifting, rain tapping on the roof, Clover's steady breathing. And behind all of it, Ethan's breathing too. Uneven, but no longer explosive. I moved slowly along Clover's body again, and the more I examined him, the more the truth became clear. There was inflammation, there was infection, there was pain, but it was not fatal, not catastrophic, not what Ethan had been carrying in his mind. This was not death, this was neglect, this was time, this was treatable. That realization changed everything inside me, because the danger was no longer physical, it was emotional. I stepped back slightly and turned toward Ethan just enough to meet his eyes without fully leaving the stall. He was watching me closely, waiting for something he didn't know how to define. I took a breath, slow, controlled, and told him the truth. Clover is not dying. He is sick. He is in pain, but he is not beyond help. For a moment, nothing happened. No reaction, no relief, just stillness. Then Ethan blinked, once, twice, like he was trying to process language that didn't match what he expected to hear.
He looked at Clover again immediately, like he needed confirmation from something physical, something real. He asked me again, his voice quieter now, almost broken. "Are you sure?" I nodded and repeated it slowly, clearly. "Clover is sick, but he can be treated." That was when something inside him finally shifted. Not violently, not explosively, but deeply. The shotgun lowered slightly in his hands, not dropped, not thrown away, just no longer held tightly. His shoulders slumped, like the tension he had been carrying for hours had suddenly stopped making sense. He took one step back, then another. And then he wasn't looking at Clover anymore. He was looking at nothing, like all the energy holding him upright had finally burned out. Mrs. Brennan made a small sound behind him, not a cry this time, just shock mixed with exhaustion. Walter didn't move forward yet. He was still watching carefully, still unsure if this calm was real. Ethan slowly lowered himself onto a wooden beam near the stall, not sitting properly, just collapsing into it. And for the first time since I arrived, he looked less like a threat, and more like someone who had simply reached the end of what they could carry. His voice came out low. He said he thought Clover was already gone, that he had come back because he couldn't live with that idea, that everything had been falling apart in his life for so long that he didn't know how to separate truth from fear anymore. The words weren't angry. They were empty, like they had been trapped inside him for a long time and finally ran out of resistance. Walter finally stepped closer, slow, careful, and said his son's name again. This time Ethan didn't react with fear or anger. He just listened. That silence was different again, less dangerous, more human. I stayed near Clover, but I wasn't focused on the medical side anymore. That part was done. What remained was stabilization, emotional stabilization, and that is always harder than physical treatment. Ethan suddenly let out a short laugh. Not humor, not relief, something cracked inside it. He said everything had been falling apart for so long that he didn't know what was real anymore. Then he looked at me again, this time not with suspicion, but exhaustion, and asked why nobody told him sooner, why nobody called him, why nobody came looking for him before everything got this bad. Mrs. Brennan started crying again after that, not loudly, not dramatically, just quietly, the kind of crying that sounds exhausted more than emotional. Walter rubbed both hands over his face slowly, like he had aged 10 years in one night. Then he admitted something I don't think he had wanted to say. He said they tried, more than once, but Ethan disappeared every time they got close. Different friends, different places, different phone numbers, different disasters. And every attempt to help him somehow turned into another fight. Ethan stared at the floor while Walter spoke, not interrupting, not denying it, just listening. Rain continued tapping softly against the roof overhead. The horses had calmed now too. Earlier they had been restless, nervous, picking up on the tension in the barn. Now they stood mostly still, only occasional shifting, soft snorts, quiet movement against hay. The entire atmosphere had changed, not safe exactly, but softer, less sharp. Ethan suddenly looked toward the shotgun resting near his boots, and the entire barn seemed to tense again for half a second. Even Clover shifted slightly. But Ethan didn't pick it up. He just stared at it, then finally pushed it away from himself with the side of his boot. A small movement, but an important one. Mrs. Brennan covered her mouth immediately after seeing that, like she was trying not to completely break down again. Walter finally moved closer to his son. Not fast, not emotional, just careful, like approaching a wounded animal. And when he reached him, Ethan didn't pull away, didn't yell, didn't threaten. He just sat there staring at the floor while his father rested a hand carefully on his shoulder. That was the moment I finally realized the situation was over. Not fixed, not healed, but over. The danger had passed, and what remained now was the damage left behind after fear finally burns itself out. Ethan looked over at Clover one more time, and his expression changed completely. Not panic, not guilt, just relief mixed with exhaustion. Like for the first time in months, maybe years, his mind had finally stopped running. Then quietly, almost too quietly to hear, he whispered Clover's name again. And this time it sounded less like fear, and more like love.
By the time the police finally arrived at the ranch, the storm had almost completely passed. The rain had softened into a faint mist drifting across the fields. Everything outside the barn looked cold and gray and exhausted, like the entire ranch had survived something terrible. Inside the barn, nobody was speaking anymore. Not really. Mrs. Brennan sat on an overturned bucket beside Clover's stall, crying quietly into both hands. Walter leaned against the wooden wall nearby, looking like he'd aged 10 years in a single night. And Ethan looked hollow, not angry anymore, not violent, just empty, like whatever had been keeping him standing for the past hour had finally burned out inside him. The shotgun was gone.
I'd thrown it outside into the mud almost 20 minutes earlier, after making absolutely sure it couldn't accidentally fire again. But honestly, nobody was thinking about the gun anymore. Not after everything that had happened. Not after Clover. The old horse stood quietly inside the stall now, breathing slower after the medication finally started easing the infection. Every now and then, Clover would nudge his head gently against the side of Ethan's shoulder. And every single time it happened, Ethan looked seconds away from completely breaking apart again. One of the deputies finally stepped inside the barn. He was older, mid-50s maybe. Tall guy with tired eyes and a sheriff jacket darkened by rainwater. The moment he saw Ethan sitting there beside Clover, his entire expression changed. Not fear, not anger, recognition. Jesus Christ, he muttered quietly. Apparently they'd grown up together, played football together in high school. Same town, same roads, same families. You could hear the disappointment in his voice more than anything else. That somehow made the whole situation feel even sadder. The deputy pulled Walter aside first. Quiet conversation, low voices, occasional glances toward Ethan. I tried not to listen while I finished checking Clover's temperature again, but out in places like that, sound carries. And eventually I realized Walter was refusing to press charges. Mrs. Brennan too. Even after everything, even after the gun, even after the threats, even after the nightmare they'd just survived, they still didn't want to destroy what was left of their son. And honestly, I understood it. Because the version of Ethan sitting there now didn't look dangerous anymore. He looked terrified. Not of prison, not of police, of himself. That's the thing people don't always understand about addiction. Sometimes the person underneath is still there somewhere, buried, drowning, but still there. And for the first time that night, it genuinely felt like Ethan understood what he'd almost done. One wrong movement, one accidental trigger pull, 1 second of panic, and he could have murdered his own parents. That realization was finally hitting him all at once. The deputy eventually crouched beside him, didn't handcuff him, didn't yell, just spoke quietly, man to man. I couldn't hear everything, but I heard enough. Rehab, mandatory treatment, psych evaluation, supervised recovery. The alternative being prison. And Ethan agreed almost immediately. Honestly, I think he would have agreed to anything at that point. He just kept staring at Clover while tears rolled silently down his face. Not dramatic crying anymore, not shouting, not emotional explosions, just silent tears. The kind that come when somebody finally realizes how close they came to losing everything. A second deputy walked in shortly after carrying a medical bag. Apparently dispatch had reported possible injuries. He checked everyone quickly. Mrs. Brennan had bruising on one wrist. Walter had elevated blood pressure that honestly worried me more than he admitted. And Ethan had deep cuts across both palms from gripping the shotgun so tightly for so long. Stress does strange things to the human body. Especially panic. Especially guilt. Especially fear. Outside, the first hints of morning had started creeping across the horizon. Not sunlight exactly. Just that strange gray-blue color the sky gets right before dawn. The storm clouds were finally breaking apart, and somehow that made everything feel even more surreal. Like we'd all survived something hidden inside the dark, and now daylight was exposing the aftermath. One of the strangest parts came next. The silence. After hours of shouting, threats, fear, crying, the silence inside that barn felt unnatural. Nobody knew what to say anymore. There are moments in life where words stop working. That was one of them. Eventually, Mrs. Brennan stood and slowly walked over toward Ethan. For a second, I honestly thought she might slap him, or scream, or collapse again. Instead, she wrapped both arms around him, and Ethan completely fell apart. Not emotionally, physically. His entire body just gave out. He dropped forward against her, sobbing so hard he could barely breathe. Walter joined them a few seconds later, and standing there watching it felt strangely invasive, like I was witnessing something deeply private, a family dragging itself back from the edge of total destruction. Clover shifted quietly in the stall beside them, slow breathing, calm now, safe. And for some reason that almost got me emotional too, because if Clover had died that night, I honestly think Ethan would have lost whatever tiny piece of himself still remained. People underestimate how deeply animals connect themselves to human memory, especially horses,
especially old horses. They become anchors, living pieces of your past. And Clover wasn't just an animal to Ethan. Clover was the last living reminder of who he used to be before drugs hollowed him out. That horse remembered him before addiction did. I stayed another hour after police finished everything, mostly because I wanted to monitor Clover, partly because none of us were really ready to leave yet. The deputy eventually stepped back over toward me while filling out paperwork. "You saved 3 lives tonight," he said quietly. I remember immediately shaking my head, because honestly, I didn't feel heroic. I felt exhausted, terrified, lucky, that's all. Luck plays a bigger role in survival than people like admitting. If that shotgun had fired lower, if Ethan had panicked harder, if Clover hadn't recognized him, if I'd arrived 5 minutes later, that night could have ended completely differently. And I think all of us knew it. By the time I finally walked back toward my Jeep, dawn had fully arrived. The fields were covered in fog. Birds had started making noise again. The world looked normal, which somehow felt wrong after a night like that. I remember stopping before getting into my vehicle and looking back at the barn one last time. Ethan stood near the entrance watching Clover through the stall gate. His shoulders looked smaller somehow, like the rage had drained out of him completely. And maybe this sounds strange, but for the first time all night, he looked human again. Not a monster, not a threat, just a broken man standing in the wreckage of his own life. 5 years have passed since that night. Clover lived another 3 peaceful years before finally passing away in his sleep. No pain, no suffering, just old age. Honestly, the best ending a horse can ask for. And Ethan stayed clean, against all odds. He finished rehab, came back to the ranch, started rebuilding things slowly, painfully slowly sometimes. Trust takes time after nights like that, but he did it. Today, he practically runs the property himself while Walter and Mrs. Brennan enjoy something close to retirement. And every now and then when I visit the ranch for routine checkups, I see Clover Jr. out in the fields, a young horse Ethan started raising not long after Clover passed. Healthy, strong, calm temperament, looks almost identical to the original. And every single time I see that horse running through those fields, I think about how close this entire story came to becoming something horrific instead. Not every dark story gets a soft ending. Most don't. That's the truth. Sometimes people don't recover. Sometimes families don't heal. Sometimes monsters stay monsters. But every once in a while, very rarely, somebody finds their way back before it's too late. And honestly, that's what scares me most about that night. Not the shotgun, not the screaming, not even the violence. It's realizing how thin the line really is between losing yourself completely and somehow finding your way back.
And that's the thing about cases like this. They don't just end when the story's over. They stay with you long after the lights go out. The night of the ranch is one of those cases. What started as a routine call turned into something none of us will ever forget. And even now, I still think about how close everything came to going completely wrong. That moment when everything could have changed in a single second stays with you. And I want to ask you something real quick. Have you ever had a moment like that? A situation where you only realized later just how bad it could have been? Drop it in the comments if you have. I read them. And honestly, some of the stories people send in are even crazier than the cases I talk about here. Now listen, this is still a new channel. Midnight Case Files is just getting started. We're building a space for real stories, strange encounters, and cases that don't sit right in your mind after you hear them. So if you're enjoying these, I'd really appreciate it if you subscribed. It helps the channel grow, and it makes sure you don't miss the next case when it drops. Because trust me, there are a lot more coming, and some of them go even deeper than this one. So stay close, stay alert, and I'll see you in the next video.